25 minutes before 11 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in. Whenever we go over to St. Augustine and we walk through the old part of town, right? Is that the oldest town in America? Is that what they say?
That's what they say.
All right, so you walk through the old part. Whether it's the oldest or not, I guess is not that important. But,
probably debatable.
But when you walk through there and you look at how the little school building is and some of the other things that are either actual buildings or replicas of buildings and things, you ask yourself, what was life really like? I mean, there are so many differences today, and it's not all technology in the form of a phone, but it could be just a shower, or even it may not even be an invention of sort. It could be just attitudes that people have toward other people. That's part of it too. I think you ladies had a completely different experience back in those days, and probably so did us guys. But when you think about that, you try to wonder what it was like, and how did they survive, and how did they handle certain things like disease or storm or things of that sort. And then there's the travel. I mean, we can get on a plane. We can go to Orlando right now, Orlando International Airport.
Yes.
We could be in Paris, 5 hours?
Yeah, we can be there.
It's just unbelievable, right? Compared to what it was like back then. Robin Lloyd is a 4-time Emmy Award-winning correspondent and producer. He's on the phone right now. He's got a new book called Rough Passage to London, A Sea Captain's Tale. This is an amazing story of which I am 35 pages into it. So I got a long way to go. So I don't want to ask him so many questions that I spoil my own read. Robin Lloyd, this is a good one. I did read the synopsis, though, so I sort of know kind of what's happening, because I haven't gotten as far as the synopsis tells me about. So anyway, good morning, Robin. How are you?
Hi, Larry. So kind of you to read the book, and yes, you've got a rough passage ahead of you, I think.
You take us back to this time, though. I'm kind of a big fan of that. I kind of like a book that brings me out of my world and into a different but believable world.
Yeah, I think it's important in the work of a historical fiction writer, as I've come to learn it, because I'm a former journalist, and so the evolution to get to write historical fiction took some work. But I think it's important to really make your fiction, if you dive into the past, very believable, and that means getting the texture, the expressions, the descriptions of, as you were saying, of everything from taking a bath to ways of expressing yourself, to ways of dress, to what you would eat, and what kind of sickness you would be vulnerable to. So for me. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just curious, was there, and I'm sorry for interrupting, I didn't mean to do that, was there something you did, a ritual? I mean, how did you get yourself to be there mentally so that you could write so authentically? Were you just immersing yourself in history books or something of that sort?
Well, to get the language of the time about you, all you can do is read the literature at the time, where people are recording conversations, or you read the letters that people wrote each other. For instance, this story of mine, it started as me at the side of my grandmother looking at an oil painting, and she said, "That's your great ancestor, an important ship captain who was great friends with Charles Dickens." I must have been 8 or 9 years old, and when she died, she left that painting to me, because his last name was my middle name. And I suddenly found myself with this portrait, this man I knew nothing about, and a number of letters from Dickens to this man that apparently had not been recorded by historians. So I didn't know really what to do with that. I put it away in the closet, frankly, until just about several years ago, when I said I've got to do something with this, and I began writing a history of the man and his times. So, dialing up the journalist in me, I started to learn everything I could about a man's life who had been 30 years at sea, had made 100 transatlantic voyages, and had gone from being a poor farm boy with a 6th grade education to meeting Queen Victoria and becoming good friends with Charles Dickens on the other side of the Atlantic. And this was too amazing to me. I think the man's mystery, what propelled me, was what I was learning about the man as I read more.
But the perception of the time is just, well, you really captured that. It's very exciting and it's very accurate, especially when he goes into this tavern. And he makes sure that, his guys don't have the pistols, but they're carrying their knives just in case. And then the other guys are getting rowdy because they think that they're, against the king and they'd rather be in a country like America. So, I mean, you can just feel it. You can just hear that conversation and see the characters visually.
Well, it's one of the compelling things I learned in doing the research here is how much of a divide there was between England and America after the War of 1812. We were called the feuding cousins, and the English looked down their nose at us, at seeing our manners as vulgar and our speech something similar to that, and they felt that we were immoral because of our support and embrace of slavery. Which they had set aside and made illegal. So there was that aspect of the upper classes looking down their noses at us. And by the same token, we had artists going the other direction, who people that you all know, Melville, Hawthorne, Longfellow, Emerson, and they were traveling on these ships. So it was sort of a cultural bridge, these three-masted ships that were bringing men of arts and letters at both directions, as England and America came to have a better understanding of each other after being at war 2 times. And I found that fascinating because this man that I'd chosen to focus on had spent 30 years doing this, if you will, sailing this cultural bridge, getting to know English, getting to know Americans of all classes. These ships were the cultural link between the old world and the new, where you had rich and poor, and they were sort of a combination of the phone lines, so AT&T, Carnival Cruise Lines, Facebook, Twitter, American Airlines, they were all in one. They were linked.
When I'm reading, I don't have an audio copy of this, so I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right. Is it Elisha? Is Elisha Eli?
Yeah, it's Elisha Ely Morgan.
Elisha Ely, okay. Elisha Ely. Okay, so all the time. It's kind of like when you read the Bible, you pronounce them all wrong in your mind, right? So Elisha, so he was a real guy. The fact that there was an oil painting of him, does that imply that he was of certain importance? I always wondered about that. If there's an oil painting, then that person in the painting must have been important.
Well, here's what was so really neat for me is there really wasn't that much material on this man until I started reading the letters of a variety of artists, Charles Robert Leslie, J.M.W. Turner, Sir Edwin Landseer. These are all famous mid-19th century English artists, and the name of this man kept popping up here and there. So he had become friends with some of his passengers. In this case, Charles Robert Leslie, who had introduced him into a wide circle of noted men of arts and letters in London. And the result was he was someone who had learned the hard trade of being a sailor at sea, and it was tough. But then, because of his passengers, the more affluent passengers, he'd come to know this rarefied group of people in London, including Queen Victoria. So the oil painting came from, it was unsigned, but he was made a honorary member of the London Sketching Club, which was a group of artists, most famous of which, I guess, is J.M.W. Turner, who were all members of the Royal Academy in London, and who had this informal club where they did sketches, and then the sketches were given to whoever was there. Well, he was made an honorary member, not because he was a painter, but because obviously they enjoyed having him around. So that gives you a sense of the character of the fellow. I got his personality from Dickens, though, because Dickens wrote a short story about him, called A Message from the Sea, in which he's on record as saying, "This is my depiction of my good friend Captain Morgan." And so I read with interest how Dickens saw him as, this witty, fast-talking fellow who was a sailor, a politician, a chess player, all these interesting aspects of a character that was quick-witted and sharp, which is maybe what Dickens and Thackeray found so appealing about the man. At any rate, it was London and the connection in London that gave me the clues as to who this man was.
And he still allows himself to have a romance.
Oh, well, that's a fun story. Really a fun story. To do this, I researched this to the nth degree, so I knew everything I could about Elisha Eli Morgan, everything from the dates and his family, his father, his mother, where they'd grown up, the farm. All that's, everything I could find, I got and had it written down, and as you would a memoir or a history. And then I looked at the blanks, and of course those were the times at sea, which gave me the reason to do the novel. But there was one great story that Dickens loved, because he loved to hear this man tell salty tales at sea. So he told us one story about a young, attractive woman on board who came to the captain in the middle of the voyage, so they're somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, and says, "Captain, I don't know what to do. I have no less than 5 suitors on board ship, and I'm quite prepared to marry one of them, but I don't know how to choose the right one. What should I do?" And he said, "Well, it's sort of a calm day outside now. What would you think if you accidentally fell overboard? And I'll, of course, have a lifeboat ready to pick you up. But surely the man who loves you the most will jump in after to save you."
I love that.
That's a fine idea, she says. So, you can imagine a woman of that time period, long flowing dresses, etc. So she falls overboard, and not one but 4 of her suitors jump in after her. So they hoist these people back up on board, and they're dripping wet, and she's furious, and she comes to the captain. She says, "Captain, I'm going to my stateroom. I need to talk to you." So the captain comes into the stateroom, and there she is, dripping wet, mad as can be, and she says, "Captain, well, what am I supposed to do? You got me into this mess. How am I supposed to pick the right one?" And he said, "Well, my dear, if you really want a sensible husband, you'll pick the dry one," which, of course, was him.
I love this.
Oh my gosh, that is a great story.
So he was the 5th suitor, and this is where fiction, in fact, become interesting, because as a fiction writer, I thought, oh, that's got to be the way they met. That's got to be him describing his wife and how they met. But I had no proof of that until I dived into Dickens's letters to her, because he wrote to not only Captain Morgan but also to her later on after the captain died, and he made mention of that story, Dickens. What? And it was quite clear. It was quite clear that was exactly the way they met, and in fact, how they became, what led to their marriage. So,
oh my God! So, am I misunderstanding you? Did you write that as a fictional piece, and then it turned out to be the actual story?
That's right.
Wow.
I looked at that and I thought, gosh, this is such a good story. It must be the way they met, because realized his life was so tied to the ship, and she was from a relatively well-to-do family. I thought, well, how in the world could he possibly meet this young American woman? He would not have had any time, because he was just going back and forth.
You were channeling him. I think you're channeling him. I think this book is, you've got some help from the other side with this one. What a great story that is. Whether the fact that it's true is even more astounding. The book is called Rough Passage to London. Tell the beginnings of the story, if you could, for our listeners.
Well, one of the things that, the 2 things, and they both are involved with research, and that's why I think with a historical fiction writer, if you do your research, the story will come to you. The War of 1812, of course, lasted a few years, and it played itself out in a number of parts of the Northeast of the United States. But one of the places it did was in the Connecticut River Valley, where in the little town of Essex, where this man had grown up on a farm, the British launched a successful raid where they destroyed 200 ships up the Connecticut River. And this was in the year 1814. And this boy his farm was maybe a mile or two from where this happened. So I thought, okay, this was clearly an important event for an 8-year-old, 9-year-old boy, imagining myself if that had happened, and it would have seared into his own mind the dangers of the British.
Right.
Yet, decades later, he would be meeting with Queen Victoria on board his ship in London. And that made me have a sense of what an important jump that this man had made in life. Secondly, in getting research, because I went to several cousins who had some letters from this time period of the family, and one of them was an 1816 letter from a random sailor telling the mother of this young fellow, Elisha Ely Morgan, who was then a young child, about 10 years old, that the older brothers, William, had gone down with a ship somewhere off of China, and Abraham and it was a cryptic note. I'm afraid I won't be able to see Abraham again, it was the way the letter went. So implying that maybe Abraham had fallen into, some tragedy, but not really saying what. And so I thought, because the family letters also said that Eli Morgan ran away from home as a teenager, I thought, well, why did he run away from home? And I thought, well, maybe to find that one brother where the family never had closure. And then I read Dickens's story, A Message from the Sea, and it's about a letter that came from a sailor, and it's about a brother that was lost at sea. And I thought, good. Morgan must have told Dickens about something that I'd stumbled across in his family history with this random letter.
Right.
Dickens must have had that same information, and he wrote his short story, which is really a story of a captain arriving in southwestern England and solving a mystery there. But it did make me think that was the way I should go too. So my plot line was totally dictated by an actual letter that where I imagined from that actual letter that this would have sent this young man off for a career at sea, as I really couldn't imagine what would have sent him to do that. He was leaving his farm, leaving his bereaved parents behind. He ran away from home. I mean, this was a case where something had to propel him forward. So I guessed there. I don't know if I was right, but I guessed.
You keep us abreast with the realities of the times. I mean, he writes his captain's log. You give us insight to that, but you also give us insight into the destructiveness, like when there was a cholera outbreak. Well,
I tried to dive into that world in every way I can, and I think that's one of the strengths of historical fiction over actual history, is that I think you can dive into the emotions, the mindset, and learn about things. Everything like what kind of cigars is he smoking? How is he dressed? What are they eating? These are things that the historian might not mention, but you as the fiction writer will have to. And I think that's one of the things that because I called myself a reluctant novelist. I really didn't necessarily want to go down the rabbit hole of writing fiction because it was such a big jump for me from being a narrative news writer. And then as I got into it, it's a different trade for sure, because you have to learn not only how to do a narrative description of something, but you've got to do conversation, you've got to do character development. Right. And in the case of historical fiction, you've really got to know your period, and as I said, everything about it, and just become familiar with it, so that you feel you are actually there, and you know enough about the period that you can be the eyes and ears for your readers, because you're throwing yourself back in a time period that they don't know about, and so you have to have the knowledge. It's somewhat like being a foreign correspondent. You're in a foreign country, and you have to describe what you see for your readers.
Where are you right now? Did I ask you that already? I can't remember. Are you...
I'm happily up here on the coast of Maine, enjoying the first tinge of red colors.
Nice.
Okay. There's a popular musical, I'm sure you're familiar with it, called Hamilton, and Hamilton is teaching us all a little bit about history. I don't know how accurate it is, but there's a character in that show, that story, who is a real historical character named Hercules Mulligan, I think. Mm-hmm. And he was a spy in a tailor during the Revolutionary War in what is now New York City. I don't know what they called it back then. Well, I guess it was still New York City already, right by then.
Oh yeah.
But anyway, I wondered if some of the characters that you are bringing to our attention will do the same thing. I mean, all of a sudden everybody knows who Hercules Mulligan is. Are we all going to know the characters in your book? And the other part of my question is, it looks like this is an earlier book, and your new book that came out this year is also a seafaring book, Harbor of Spies.
Well, yeah, it's quite a different book. Harbor of Spies came out this year, so it's the new book, and it's about Cuba during our Civil War, which most historians have sort of neglected. Cuba was an important supply depot for arms and ammunition for the South and the Gulf of Mexico area. And the cotton that the South needed to survive came out from the Gulf, including Florida, to Cuba, from whence it went to Europe. And so the whole Gulf of Mexico was very much of a naval theater, where ships coming out of Cuba that were fast, and in some cases British-built steamships, were running through the naval blockade that the U.S. Navy had created in the Gulf of Mexico to get into ports like Mobile and Galveston and St. Martin, Florida, not far from you.
Yeah.
To get the arms out.
I like how you bring the similarity in the generations. I mean, that one lady was appalled because there was a new dance some of the couples were doing called the waltz, and she thought that should be banned, and he said that no, I'm not going to get in the middle of this. But each generation seems to have their own comments about the previous generation.
Right. Well, I actually found that in a letter when I was researching it, where I just found that from mother to daughter, and I thought, oh, this is incredible. that
is amazing.
That the waltz was once considered quite revolutionary and way too risque.
Quite risque. Yeah, that was amazing. I love this book.
Wow. Well, and my mention of Hamilton was only because the newer book, Harbor of Spies, is about spies. So that's why I brought that up. Robin, what a great conversation. Thank you for taking some time to be with us today by way of the phone. I have a copy of Rough Passage to London. If I have a listener who would like that one, you can call me and have it. Both books I found on Amazon. And I was wondering if you had a website you wanted to recommend.
Well, you can type in my name, robinlloyd.org, and that should get to the website. But you can also just do either Harbor of Spies or Rough Passage to London with my name, and that should get you to the webpage as well. Okay, very good. Thank you so much, Robin. And I have somebody on the phone wanting the book. I'll get you in a second. This is WOCA Ocala.
Fox News, I'm Chris Foster. Senators have just voted 51-49 to limit debate and vote tomorrow on Brett Kavanaugh's Supreme Court nomination. Iowa Republican Chuck Grassley.
Before left-wing outside